Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. So here we are, for yet another episode of Strange as It Seems. And it has been a little while longer since the last one, and just in the way of an explanation, not an excuse. We've been busy. Things come up. And we'll try to keep things on a general sort of 2-week schedule, but there may be things that just prevent that from happening. So let's get on with it. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, several things. Or maybe a few things. Let's put it that way. We're going to be talking about lost continents. In particular, everybody's two favorite lost continents, Atlantis and Lemuria, and where those come into the picture and exactly what the difference is between the two. And I know some of you are saying, well, it's very simple. Atlantis was in the Atlantic and Lemuria was in the Pacific. Well, it turns out it's not quite as simple as that because sometimes they seem to change positions. It takes a while before Atlantis and Lemuria, as we think about them today, become clearly separated into different parts of the world. But from that, we're then going to go into the realm of subterranean realms. This whole idea that there's either a hollow earth or there's a earth full of a bunch of holes and that somebody lives down there. And so that will bring us to the Shaver mystery. It will bring us to, that's how we'll end up with the idea that there are Lemurians living in caves under Mount Shasta in Northern California. And yes, that is a real thing. So how do you get Lemurians into caves? Well, first you have to have Lemuria. So the question with this type of thing is where to begin. And so we're going to be talking about different books, different authors. I'm not going to try to bring in every book that has ever been written about those topics. There are many of them. Most of them are derivative from something else. So what I'm going to try to stick to are the works that are influential on the others. So where does the modern idea of Atlantis come from? And of Lemuria and of subterranean civilizations as well. How do we sort of get to where we are now with those things? And when it comes to Atlantis, it all goes back to one guy, Plato. And without Plato, it would be safe to say there would be no Atlantis, because in one of his works, his dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, which was written about 360 BCE. See, I used the appropriate term, BCE. That's where the fundamental story of Atlantis is laid out. But it's interesting to look at how that story is put together. So, Timaeus and Critias are dialogues involving different characters, and Critias is one of them. And they're talking about various things that have happened. Some people argue that the whole thing was a setup for Plato's ideas about a perfect, a utopian society, his concept of the Republic, and that he simply invented the story of Atlantis as a kind of mythical realm in which to set the idea of his perfect society, or a kind of foil for that perfect society. We don't really know what his intentions were. We just know that the story of Atlantis crops up as one story among these dialogues, and what it basically relates is that, so remember, Plato is writing about 360 BCE. Well, it's talking about an event that happened more than 200 years earlier, I think around 590 BCE. And there was an Athenian diplomatic delegation that went to Egypt. And a particular politician by the name of Solon, and while in Egypt, Solon had a conversation with an Egyptian priest whose name I think is Sonchis or Sonchis, Sonchis, however you want to pronounce. I'll say Sonchis.
Okay.
Sonchis of Sais. Okay. Who there's some other references, so this was probably a person that existed. Solon definitely existed. But note that right away, if Plato isn't making up the story, if he's actually relating a story that does come back from Solon's visit to Egypt, he's talking about something that one guy told another guy 200 years earlier. So at best, Plato is repeating a story told by one person, told to them by another one, and Sonchis, since he wasn't in Atlantis, must have gotten that from somebody else. So this is a third or fourth hand tale, with often centuries between the portions of the tale. And usually you wouldn't credit that with being a particularly reliable source of info. It's the only one we've got.
Yeah.
But there are those kinds of basic limitations. So the basic idea, the yarn that Solon was spun in Egypt was that, well, back around, they do give rather specific dates in this, around 9,000 years before. So from our time, about 11,000 years before us, there existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. How far beyond them, it's not entirely clear. Not so much a continent, but a large island. In fact, it seems to be a series of islands existed. And you get contradictory descriptions. So at one point, the Atlantis, or at least the Atlantean Empire, is described as larger than Libya and Asia combined.
Wow.
So what exactly do they mean by Libya and Asia? So far as we can figure, Libya to the Greeks at that time meant North Africa west of Egypt.
Yeah.
Everything that would be sort of Libya, the country today, and Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, all the way out to the Atlantic. And even that's kind of vague because it's not clear where they had Egypt stop. So,
yeah.
But anyway, Northwest Africa was their description of Libya. And Asia at that time to them pretty much meant Asia Minor. It meant maybe the Near East, the sort of eastern end of the Mediterranean, the Holy Land, and Anatolia. That's still a fairly big area. But that seems to have been the areas that the Atlanteans supposedly conquered on the mainland, because the one description of the size of Atlantis itself is using the sort of Greek stadia measurement. They give a description of an oblong large island that's about 350 miles long and about 250 or so across the middle part of it. It's mountainous, described having mountains along the coast and mostly in the north. It has a large, elaborate, multi-ringed capital city somewhere in the south of it. But if you look at that size, that would mean an island roughly the size of England. Okay, not England and Scotland, but just England, maybe without Wales. So, but a good-sized island. And so the Atlanteans are described as a maritime people and as a naval empire. And from their home island, they sort of spread out in different directions. And it's mentioned that from the island of Atlantis, which, by the way, simply means the island of Atlas, in the same way that the Atlantic Ocean is the ocean of, and Atlas is a titan, the guy that holds up the world. But that's what it is. It's the island of Atlas in the ocean of Atlas, beyond the Pillar of Hercules, beyond the mountains of Atlas, which are in the Libyan part that they conquer. So through other islands, they eventually reach the Libyan mainland and they conquer those areas, but they end up in a war with Athens. Now, that's kind of interesting because this would mean that Athens existed 11,000 years ago, which I'm not even sure. I think that was kind of news to the Athenians. I don't think that there had been, there's nothing to suggest archaeologically that Athens was around 11,000 years ago. But whatever. And the Athenians were given credit for stopping the Atlantean conquest, that they'd overrun all of this territory. The Athenians defeat them. And then essentially because the Atlanteans they lose the favor of the gods, they're arrogant, and their island is destroyed. It sinks beneath the waves and done away with. So that's the basic story. So you get some sense as to how big it is. Remember, a large island as opposed to a continent, that it's beyond the Pillars of Hercules, some way out in the Atlantic. It's not entirely clear, and that there appear to be other islands between it and the mainland. And Athens existed 11,000 years ago. So, you can put this into a larger context. One of the things that we know now, but we didn't know even probably 20, 30 years ago, is that 11,000 years ago, there was more civilization going on than we thought they were. The Göbekli Tepe ruins that have been found in the Near East, which, are these rather massive megalithic structures that don't appear to be cities. They don't appear to be cities that people live in. They apparently, we always have some ritual purpose if we can't think of anything else. But human beings are quite capable of building large, sophisticated stone structures 11,000 years ago, or not long ago, we would have argued that was impossible. So there was something going on, which doesn't, that's a long ways away from what Atlantis is supposed to be. But it would suggest that 11,000 years ago wasn't as uncivilized or primitive as we might previously have thought it was. The ability to construct something like Göbekli Tepe means that you had the labor in order to do that, which means you had to have some kind of sizable population groups. Small groups of hunter-gatherers or Neolithic farmers wouldn't have built something like that. You needed a lot of people in order to do it.
Which coincides with settled agriculture begins 12, 11, 10,000 years, something like that.
As far as we know.
Yeah.
All right. And let's face it, we don't know.
Yeah.
We guess.
It's a lot of.
So, Göbekli Tepe didn't figure in anyone's guesses 50 years ago because no one knew that it existed. So now you have to fit that into the larger framework of what you know. But I think it means that what we would give credit for is civilization goes further back than we would assume. So that's the basic story of Atlantis. That's what you have to work with. And there are some fairly specific things there. One, it's clearly stated it's out in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere. Okay. And the reason why that's, I think, important to get clear in terms of Plato's story, the only story that we have about it, is that since then, it has been placed virtually everywhere. I don't know if you can't, there are people who argue that, no, Atlantis was in the Amazon jungle. No, it was in Denmark. Okay.
I heard that
for some reason. No, it was an island off Greece, the island of Thera, which was a volcano, and it blew up and basically sank. And there are people who would argue, I can remember, I think the National Geographic article, this is it. We found Atlantis. Yeah, that's it. It matches all the description, except it's not where Plato said it was, or where Sanchez said it was, or somebody said it was. So the position there seems to be pretty, it has to be in that place. And I don't think it counts if it's not. It may be something else, but it's not the Atlantis as described in Plato's dialogues. So the other thing that there's nothing in this, by the way, that, the Atlanteans were apparently an advanced maritime society, but there's nothing about them having flying cars or anti-gravity weapons or being evil wizards or anything. Nothing about that. They do apparently are quite conceited, and this is what offends the gods, and they're
Isn't the moral of the story
destroyed.
basically like moral corruptions that takes place within Atlantis or something like that?
So all societies can be corrupt. And see, this is what happened with the Atlanteans. So it could be one of those things. It's just a story that Plato made up, or it could be based upon something that he heard and how accurate the details were. I find that they do give fairly specific time frame and actually give some kind of physical description of the place. Those are interesting details to have. Doesn't mean they all couldn't have been. Doesn't mean Plato couldn't have made them up. But if he was just going to make up a story for his purposes, I don't know why he would need to do that. It wouldn't matter how long ago that it was. So the idea that it's somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but it's not definite where, it led some speculation. Now, by the time we get around to the Age of Reason, okay, we get around to the 16th century, and you got people like Francis Bacon who became interested in the Atlantis myth, and others. There were some who argued that really what they're being talking about here is Atlantis is the Americas. Because it's beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and there are islands, the Azores and others in between there. So that's where this comes from, the Atlantean. So that would mean that, well, if some of it sank, then most of it clearly didn't, since there were still two large American continents there. And that idea, Francis Bacon was a Rosicrucian and Freemason and an occultist, and was very interested in he is often considered to be the kind of godfather of the British Empire. Okay. He wrote a book called The New Atlantis, which was his treatise on a ideal society, but also the idea that Britain's role was to become the new Atlantis, that it was become a great world dominating maritime empire. And what did it become? A great world dominating maritime empire. But that's sort of the vision that that Bacon and others had for this. But there were Spanish and Portuguese explorers and scholars who thought the same thing, that what Plato was actually talking about was the Americas. So those are just the kind of vague beginnings to the entire thing. And the idea pretty much just floats around as a story told by Plato that might refer to this place or that place until we get to the 19th century, and especially around the 1880s, where all kinds of things happen.
Yeah.
Okay. 1880s is very lively decade for things happen. Jack the Ripper, okay. All kinds of things. Huge blizzards.
Yeah.
All these happen in the 1880s. So it's in the 19th century that you also get the other myth which comes along of Lemuria. Now, I have to say that as opposed to Atlantis, as far as I know, there are no, at least in any kind of Western tradition, stories about a continent of Lemuria in the Pacific. And that's partly because Europeans didn't know about the Pacific until the 16th century. So how could they put a continent there? But nobody much else around that area seems to have. I mean, everybody has stories of fantastic islands, of strange lands that are out there in the ocean in some cases. But while Atlantis has a history to it, it goes back at least to 360 BCE, even if Plato just invented the story, that Lemuria is very much a creation of the 19th century. And it actually begins, one of the guys who stars on it is an English scholar by the name of, trying to think of his name here, Sclater. There we go. It was right at the top of my notes, and I wasn't even looking at it.
Never heard that one.
So between about somewhere between about 1850 and 1860, there is a British, essentially geologist by the name of Philip Sclater, who was very interested. One of the things he was interested in, well, zoologist, I think is probably a better term. He was interested in lemurs.
Oh,
Okay. These little things that aren't quite monkeys.
sure.
You find them in Madagascar and you find them in India and Ceylon. And so he wondered how it was that lemurs were now on these separate land masses separated by water. And so his idea was that at one time there had to be a single homeland of the lemurs.
Mhm.
Let's call it Lemuria. Okay. So why is Lemuria called Lemuria? Because of the lemurs.
Okay.
So there had to be this single landmass that all the lemurs came from,
Right.
and that if much of it collapsed, that would explain why they were all in these different areas, these different islands or subcontinents today. And that idea has sort of continued along. That was a concept picked up in the 20th century, I think. That was an idea picked up by Tamil nationalists. So Tamils are an ethnic group in Ceylon and Sri Lanka. There we go.
Yeah.
In Sri Lanka and southern India, their homeland is called Tamil Nadu. And an idea that became part of Tamil nationalism was the Tamils were the oldest, coolest civilization in South Asia, and they were all heirs to some great super civilization. And that was, they don't call it Lemuria. I think it's something like Kumari Kadam. There's but a large landmass somewhere south of modern day India in the Indian Ocean. So it sort of took this idea that was originally to explain why lemurs were scattered around this area, and now this became part of a ancient Tamil super civilization. So notice that the whole thing doesn't start on the Pacific. Okay. It's in the Indian Ocean. And it's meant largely to address questions of zoology and even of sort of evolution of lemur species in the area. But the idea that seed was planted. And it seems to have gotten to the point in the 19th century that where anyone looked out and they saw a vast expanse of an ocean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the idea was, well, there had to be land there at some point. Okay. So let's plop down a gigantic continent in the middle of it because all of that should have been filled up with land. No, it shouldn't. But anyway, it's empty. So let's populate it with something. Let's populate it with continents of one kind. So Sclater got the whole thing going. And that was then picked up by a Frenchman, I think, Charles Etienne Brasseur de Bourbourg. He has to be French or Belgian. And so, again, in the 1860s, he then took this idea of lost land masses. And he's not talking about Lemuria. He's now talking about something which he calls Mu.
That's the one I was thinking.
There we go. Okay, so where does Mu come in? Mu and Lemuria are often the same. Well, how did they become the same thing? Okay, so remember, Sclater was talking about a large continent full of lemurs in the Indian Ocean.
Uh-huh.
So we'll call him Brasseur de Bourbourg. He thinks that Mu was the original homeland of the Maya, because he is a linguist and an ethnologist, or at least what passes for that in the middle of the 19th century. And he's fascinated by the Maya. Lots of people are. Maya were highly sophisticated civilization, Central America. And like many after him, or maybe he was the first, he somehow believed that the Mayans were all part of first of all, they were a much older civilization than what they were given credit for. So he thought they were at least as old as the civilization in Egypt. And we'll notice that this becomes a kind of consistent theme, that the Maya are connected to the Egyptians or to somebody, and that they are much older than is necessarily assumed, and that they're at least contemporaries of old world classical civilizations. So one of the things he was working on was one of the Mayan codexes, one called the Troyan Codex. And the problem, of course, was how you deciphered Mayan script. And one of the ways that was done was to simply throw stuff at it to see what worked. I mean, you could come up with different ideas, different theories about what the script meant, and you could make them work. You would simply assign values to the different characters, and out of that you would construct words, and you would say that you had deciphered the language, which in his case he had not. Okay, he was quite wrong. But that's where he comes up with this whole idea that there was this ancient land called Mu. And that's where the Mayans came from. And that's where the Egyptians, that was the kind of motherland of the Mayans and everybody else. And it also gets a little confused. He thinks that you can find a connection to this in Egypt because the first ruler of Egypt, he believes, was Queen Mu, from Mu.
Okay.
And that's where humans are brought into this. And this is where the connection between the Mayans, you know, the idea of Lemuria or Mu as being the kind of motherland of all civilizations, and there being a connection between the Mayans and Egypt. So those are in the 1860s. And you get another fellow who comes along in the early 1880s. He sounds French as well, but I think he's actually British. Augustus de Plongeon. So Augustus de Plongeon, around 1881, he also is fascinated in the Mayans. And he is aware of the work of Brasseur de Bourbourg, and he also studies the Mayan texts like the Popol Vuh, and he believes that, yes, he buys the whole idea that Mu was the original home of the Mayans, but he identifies it with Atlantis. He argues that Mu, in this case, is not on the Pacific, but in the Atlantic, and it's the actual name of what it was that Plato was describing as Atlantis. And of course, he believes that the Mayans came from there, and the Mayan and Egyptian civilizations are connected for the same sort of reasons. Now, about a year or so later, in 1882, there's an American, who comes up with this is a fellow by the name of John Newbrough. John Newbrough is an interesting guy. Now, John Newbrough is a spiritualist, I suppose we could say. You know, he channels spirits. And in channeling spirits, he eventually comes up with a book called Oaspe. I think it's Oahspe. We still find Oaspe, a new Bible. So this is supposed to be, he's doing a Joseph Smith thing here. He's going to create his own sort of new Bible. And it includes lots of things, none of which we're going to talk about now. But it's still influential in certain circles. But he now talks about another continent called Pan, the continent of Pan, which was in the northern Pacific. Yeah. So keep in mind, so it's Newbrough and his channeling, who's the first person to now place a lost continent in the Pacific. Because Lemuria was in the Indian Ocean and Mu seems to be in the Atlantic, and now you've got something called Pan. The Pan thing doesn't seem to catch on. This is the only kind of reference to that. And he notes that Pan was destroyed, sank beneath the waves about 24,000 years ago, and which would be about twice as long as the end of Atlantis. And it was inhabited by an advanced people called the Cosmon race. We don't know much about them either. They might have come from other planets. But so there's a lost continent of Pan, but you see how the things sort of, these moving pieces are sort of going back and forth. And then it's on the same year in 1882 that you have a Minnesota populist politician by the name of Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. And if that doesn't tell you that he was an Irish Catholic, it should. But Ignatius Donnelly also was fascinated in many subjects. And one of the things that he was fascinated in was the whole idea of Atlantis, you know, based largely on the story of Pluto. And so in 1882, he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And it's really Donnelly who sort of brings a lot of this stuff together. He gets a whole sort of Atlantis circus on the road. Yeah. And he accepts, for instance, the Atlantis Mayan connection that's now become, you know, sort of the general story that comes through. But he also identifies the destruction of Atlantis with the biblical flood.
Huh.
It was like, the flood, it flooded the whole world. Well, that's what happened to Atlantis. So that would seem to make sense. That's when it happened. The book became popular and was widely read. And for its time was probably one of the most influential ideas of just spreading general awareness of the lost continent of Atlantis. Oh, I also believe that Atlantis was the home, not just of the Maya and of other people, but specifically of the Irish.
I think it was Mu was the one that I always had heard that was connected to.
But, Mu is, Long John says Mu and Atlantis are the same thing.
Yeah.
So take your pick. This is a work in progress.
Maybe that's the Irish-Egyptian connection too, right?
The Irish live in an island in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Okay, they're already halfway there. I mean, I'm sure someone has argued that Ireland is Atlantis.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Why not?
I've heard the Canary
It fits the bill. It's an island. It's about the right size.
Yeah.
And it's beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Yeah.
Okay, the position is kind of vague, so there we have it. Ireland could be Atlantis. But at least, Donnelly isn't even claiming. He's claiming that there was a separate Atlantis. There was another Ireland before there was Ireland, and the Irish were only one of the peoples who
they fled one island
who came out of this type of thing. But now you have to add yet someone else into the mix who's also going to become influential, and this, of course, is Madame Helena Blavatsky.
Uh-huh.
And for the uninitiated into Blavatsky and the wonderful world of Theosophy, which has come up in previous episodes, Madame Blavatsky was a Russian mystic, sometimes spy, who was a spiritualist and a piano teacher, and she became probably one of the most influential occult philosophers in the last 200 years. And she did this by channeling messages from the Ascended Masters. The Ascended Masters are spiritually advanced beings who guide the spiritual evolution of mankind, and she was in psychic contact with them and received communications from Master Moria and Kuthumi and others. And they would fill her in on all kinds of stuff that she put into books like The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled. And most of her stuff was published in the late 1888, I think, is when The Secret Doctrine comes out. So she's just a few years after Donnelly and the rest. Well, Blavatsky fits Atlantis and Lemuria into her cosmology, and she establishes them as two different continents who existed at different times. Lemuria is the older of the two, so its heyday it goes back like 700,000 years ago. And it spreads over a huge area. I mean, it's not only covers much of the Pacific, but it actually worms its way into the Indian Ocean as well. So it includes the lemurs, apparently. And so it begins about 700,000 years ago in Blavatsky's, I'll simplify her cosmology. She believed that humans advanced through a series of what she called root races. And those actually began with sort of amoeba-like beings that didn't have physical bodies. So by the time we get to Lemuria, you have the third root race. And the third root race are very large. They don't look anything like modern humans. They're essentially giants. And they have 3 eyes. Okay. Blavatsky developed some of this. Other Theosophist writers after tended to elaborate this idea. But they have 3 eyes. That has sort of stuck with stories about Lemurians. So, for instance, those who described Lemurians living under Mount Shasta have sometimes described them as having 3 eyes. Of course, the original Blavatsky description, though, is somewhat different because the 3 eyes aren't in the front of the head. No. If you had a third eye, where could you use it? The back of the head.
Oh, come on.
Yes. No.
Come on.
Their third eye is in the back of their head. Well, that would be useful. You really need another eye in the front of your head?
I was thinking third eye, forehead, but then I was afraid you were going to go somewhere kind of vulgar with it, so I didn't want to guess.
No, I would never do that. That was from the back of their head. And then you see in modern humans that has degenerated down to the pineal gland or pineal gland.
Yeah.
Is that near the back of our head? I thought it was.
That was in the center of your. I don't know.
Okay.
I've never done DMT.
Anyway, so they had 3 eyes. One of them was in the back of their head, and they were giants. And they were the first of the root races to actually have material bodies, but they also were hermaphrodites. There was the Lemurians had no sexes.
Yeah.
Wasn't until you get to the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans in the 5th root race were the first ones to have clearly divided genders.
Right.
So the kind of, gender fluid Lemurians, giant 3-eyed gender fluid Lemurians lived in their continent, and it lasted from around 700,000 years ago, maybe up to about 50,000 when it broke apart and sank in a series of cataclysms.
Mm-hmm.
So the Atlanteans come after that. Atlantis sort of appears, there may be some kind of period of overlap. So the people who were the Atlanteans originally came from Lemuria. Everybody came from Lemuria.
Yeah.
That was the 3rd root race, and the 5th, 4th root race, there had to be one of those. And the 5th, which populated Atlantis. And that gave rise again to all kinds of people, one of which were the Aryans, but that was only one of those groups. And Aryans came in different colors and varieties. So, the Ariosophists, the Nazi occultists we were talking about last time, simplified that for their kinds of purposes. But so Blavatsky is the one who tends to, I'll give her credit for establishing Lemuria and Atlantis as 2 different lost continents in 2 different oceans existing with a slight overlap between them, but Lemuria being the elder of the 2. But that's her stuff. No one else had clearly differentiated that before. Now, in fact, one of the the guy who probably contributes most of the theosophical view of this, Blavatsky gets the ball rolling in the secret doctrine. But then later on, I think in the 1890s, I think originally in 1896, and then in 1904, there was a fellow by the name of William Scott Elliot, who was a theosophist writer. And one of the things he wrote in 1896 was the story of Atlantis, which sort of takes all of the revealed theosophical knowledge about Atlantis and puts it into one handy volume. And then in 1904, he also writes one called The Lost Lemuria, the home of the 3rd root race. So first he writes about Atlantis, then he'll write another one around Lemuria. So that's in 1904. Now, interestingly enough, among the different theosophists who were inspired by these writings was an American by the name of Edgar Lucian Larkin. And so Larkin was from around 1900 to the early 1920s, was the head of the Mount Lowe Observatory north of Los Angeles. So before there was Griffith Park Observatory or anything on Mount Wilson, Mount Lowe had an observatory, kind of a commercial observatory. And Larkin was an astronomer, although probably in many ways a kind of self-taught one. And he was a theosophist. He was an ardent theosophist. In fact, he was a member of the Crotona colony in the Hollywood Hills. So not many people know this, but in the early 20th century up to the 20s, there was a thing called the Crotona colony, Krotona, named after Pythagoras' original colony. His secret society, and it was up in the Hollywood Hills. You can still find remnants of it there today. It was a colony of theosophists, and they built bungalows and lived in them before then basically moving to Ojai. They'll decamp from there because LA became too urbanized. So he was connected to the Crotona. He was a heavy-duty theosophist and an astronomer. And so one of the things that he began to claim, and this is some time prior to the First World War, is that through a telescope. Now, there you get a couple of versions of this story. One is that using the telescope on Mount Lowe, he was able to see Mount Shasta to the north, hundreds of miles to the north. Okay, so those unacquainted with the geography, Mount Low is just north of LA, okay, Pasadena. And then if you go way, way north in California, almost to Oregon, you will find Mount Shasta. They are nowhere near each other. And at considerably different elevations. So one story is that he's using Mount Low, and the other is that he took a telescope and he sort of carted it up to the top of the San Gabriel Range, the mountains north of it. And you get up to that visual crest. And from there, he was trying to look north at Mount Shasta. And the long and short of it is that he claimed to have seen in the morning light golden domes and buildings rising out of the sides of the mountains. I think there are even descriptions of being able to see, tall beings in white robes. I'm not sure you could see the three eyes, but you could see this mystical city rising out of the mountains. And he said he saw that with a telescope. Or someone said he said that. One of the things I've been sort of looking at is where he specifically says this, or whether this is someone says that he said it. But I'm perfectly willing to believe that, yes, remember, he's inspired by Theosophical writings, and he believes those to be true. And that seems to be pretty convincing evidence. And I remember one of the first descriptions I got for this. Well, this is all proven, because this guy Larkin actually saw Lemurian buildings on Mount Shasta, and he can't deny with what it was that he saw. There is a problem. And the problem is that given that Mount Shasta and Larkin's location, north of Los Angeles, are very far apart, it is physically impossible with a telescope to see Mount Shasta. The Earth curves. Not to mention there's all the valley smog. I mean, you can't do it. So what's being described here is physically impossible. So either he was looking at something else or somebody was making something up. But nevertheless, that story is stuck again because it's a good story. But, for a while I was all of this made more sense to me once I found out that Larkin was a theosophist, because now I know where he got the basic idea from, and he was then finding evidence to support that. So that's the story. So Larkin dies 1925. And curiously enough, in that same year, in August 1925, an article appears in a magazine called The Mystic Triangle, published in California. And the Mystic Triangle, as it turns out, is a publication of the ancient and mystical order of the Rosy Cross, the Rosicrucians, specifically the American Rosicrucian order founded some years earlier by Harvey Spencer Lewis. The Rosicrucians in Santa Cruz. Okay, this is the same place. If you go to Santa Cruz, California today, not Santa Cruz, San Jose, wrong San. Okay. Santa Cruz is nearby, but that's at the beach. In San Jose, not Santa Cruz, is the Rosicrucian Museum and the headquarters of AMORC, Ancient Mystical Order of the Rose Cross, with their whole fakey Egyptian museum, which is still kind of cool. And even, Lewis's tomb under a pyramid. So, one of the things that Harvey Spencer Lewis liked to do was to write under pseudonyms. So we find out that there's this article, rather short article, in a Rosicrucian publication, and it's written by a Frater Selvius. Now, no great surprise, Frater Selvius was Harvey Spencer Lewis, just using that name. So what did this article basically describe? It gave this, using Larkin as its source. It says, Larkin was able to discover all of the revelations of the presence of a Lemurian colony. Refugees from drowned Lemuria found a refuge in Mount Shasta, and they've built an entire city within it. That city later gets a name called Talos. I've also seen it as Talos. Take your pick. I'm not sure where the name comes into it, but eventually, what is a colony now becomes an entire anthill of Lemurians. That's what Mount Shasta is, an anthill of Lemurians. So the article isn't very long. It also describes people traveling on a train between Portland and San Francisco, and you kind of go down past Mount, and supposedly people would see weird lights in the mountains all the time. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but that's just takes sort of Larkin's tale and puts it into a magazine article, publicizes it. And about a year later, 1926, I get a fellow, I think British, by the name of James Churchward. And James Churchward now writes a book called The Lost Continent of Mu. In fact, he'll have a whole series of Mu books. Lost Continent of Mu, and then it's The Children of Mu. I don't know, The Grandchildren of Mu. So he's now back on the Lemuria Mu kick, which is going on. He brings in the idea, of course, is that Mu, aka Lemuria, was a super advanced civilization. They had all kinds of cool technology. It was also the motherland of mankind, sort of taking off from Blavatsky at that point. How did he know this? Well, when he had served as an officer in India and Burma, and while there, priests had taken him into their confidence and they had showed him ancient clay tablets written in the ancient, or even more ancient, Naga Maya language of the Nakal people. Naacal, the Nakal. Now, they supposedly were the race of beings who had lived on the continent of Mu and had this advanced technology. They were again large, more or less giants. They were also very dark or black skinned. Now their ancestors being the sort of Melanesian people, with the Australian Aborigines. But they had a very advanced civilization. He doesn't date as far back as Blavatsky, though. He argues that their Mu flourished between about 50,000 and 12,000 years ago. So it ended around the same time as Atlantis did. But he doesn't think Atlantis is important. It was just kind of a colony of Mu and the Nakal people. But they still sort of survive with different secret societies. There are actually still sort of secret cells of the Nakal that exist around the world, probably hidden in caves. Although he doesn't connect them directly to Mount Shasta. Not to be outdone by this, a few years later in 1931, we now have a guy by the name of Wisher Spenley Survey, who writes a book called Lemuria, the Lost Continent of the Pacific. Now, who's Wisher Spenley Survey? That's not a real name, thank God. That's Harvey Spencer Lewis. And all this book is a greatly extended riff on the article he had written as Frater Silvius back in 1925. Also probably in some way influenced by the success that Churchward's book had in promoting the idea of Lemuria. Churchward in that same year came out with the Children of Mu, the second volume in this. So this is really where the whole idea of Lemuria becomes established. And again, you can notice that Atlantis is a story that has legs. It goes back a long time, millennia, in fact. Lemuria is largely a creation of a series of books in the early 20th century. Now, there's a way in which this stuff began to percolate into popular culture. And one interesting place is in the Alley-Oop comic strip. I don't know how many people remember Alley-Oop. I do. It used to be, read the comics. Alley-Oop was a caveman. And he had a pet dinosaur named Dinny. And he had a girlfriend named Ula. So it was all these kind of comic adventures of Alley-Oop the caveman.
This is the one where he's always making a wheel or something. I feel like, what year, I guess?
Well, Alley-Oop probably goes back to the 30s.
Yeah.
It was still current in the 60s. I don't think it's around anymore. But if you look for it, Alley-Oop.
Yeah.
There was even a song about Alley-Oop. Okay. But the thing that even as a tyke reading this, that it never made any impression on me at the time, is that there are sort of two caveman kingdoms that exist in this comic strip. And one is called Mu, and the other is called Lem. And they're constantly fighting each other. And there's the king of Mu and the king of Lem. Well, that's not accidental. Whoever the creator of the comic was somehow aware of the concept of prehistoric lands with the name Mu, and, Lemuria was too long for cavemen to say, certainly. And so just appropriated that for these two comic strip caveman kingdoms so that they show up there as well. But that's not the only place. Even Gene Autry, the singing cowboy, gets involved in this.
Okay.
So in 1935, there was a serial produced called The Phantom Empire. And this featured Gene Autry, singing cowboy, and his radio ranch, and his struggle with this group of weird people who lived in a hidden city 25,000 feet down beneath the desert in the land of Morania. Okay, not Lemuria, not Atlantis, not Mu, not Pan, but Morania. But there are references in, I think it's a 12-part cliffhanger serial. I have watched it. It's, moderately entertaining. But the whole thing is that there's this hidden city powered by radium, and even in the series, they're not quite clear whether the Morania is the survivor of Lemuria or Atlantis, but one of those two. And they've survived down in this underground city, and they have robots to do the work for them, which are some of the lamest robots I've ever seen portrayed on film. It's like buckets for heads.
All right.
But nevertheless, they have a super civilization. They also have a gigantic elevator, but they ride horses. But nevertheless, so they come up and ride around a steel cattle and take them back down to their city. And of course, in the end, the whole place is destroyed.
Yeah.
And various hijinks ensue. But that's another way that this then gets, here it is in somewhere undifferentiated in the American Southwest. There is a hidden Atlanto-Lemurian city, 25,000 feet down, powered by radium and served by robots. So that, I think, is just a little example as to how all these ideas that begin, some of them begin in scientific sphere, if you're talking about a landmass where the lemurs could run free, and then sort of appropriated by various occultists, and then finding its way into everything from comic strips to singing cowboy serials, so that Atlantis and Lemuria became terms that people were relatively familiar with. So that is, I guess that sort of brings us, when we get to Lemuria, we'll get to Mount Shasta rather, and Lemurians living underneath it, and not to mention Gene Autry's, Moranians. You get into this whole realm of the idea of people living underground. And not just in a kind of troglodyte way, not just in a caveman way, even though cavemen really didn't apparently live in caves, but the concept of whole civilizations, of whole kind of hidden civilizations existing in caverns underground, or even in a completely hollow earth. So can we stop for just a second? Yeah. Great. Okay. So the idea of subterranean realms, lost civilizations beneath the earth. Well, one of the first places you can kind of get a segue between these two things is, let's go back to 1909. So on April the 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette, then one of the main newspapers in Arizona, ran an article which talked about a fantastic discovery in the Grand Canyon. And it was a fantastic discovery supposedly made by two scientists from the Smithsonian Institute, and their names were given. I think one was S.A. Jordan, another fellow by the name of G.E. Kincaid. These two men had been exploring around the Marble Canyon area, and they had discovered a cavern, an entrance to a cavern or a system of caverns in the wall of the Grand Canyon, and that this was full of what they identified as Egyptian antiquities. There was like a whole Egyptian city built back into the walls of the Grand Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that fuels speculation is that, well, from things that had already appeared, this must be how on earth did Egyptians get there? Or were they Atlanteans? Because if the Atlanteans were the progenitors of Egypt, then this easily could have been the projection of, the Atlanteans were basically the same thing, then this could be Atlantean ruins. Now, the interesting thing about the story is that there was subsequent investigation. So the Smithsonian was queried. They want to do an interview with your guys, Jordan and Kincaid. And Smithsonian said, we never heard of them. We don't have anybody who works here under that name. We don't know what's going on. We don't have any artifacts. We don't know anything about this. Well, you got one of two answers to this. One is that this was some kind of a hoax. So one idea is it was simply a hoax by the newspaper in order to increase circulation. I tell you what, let's claim we found an Egyptian city in a cave in the Grand Canyon. That'll increase circulation. Now, had the article appeared a few days earlier, say on the 1st of April, I think you could be pretty much sure of that. But it's on the 5th. So it's not exactly an April Fool's joke. So it could have been just a stunt. These things happen. Or it could have been a story that someone actually told to a reporter of the Arizona Gazette. And we don't know who they were. The Grand Canyon, I think only in 1908 Teddy Roosevelt had turned it into a national park. One of the things that did, by the way, is that it prohibited gold mining there. And it is mentioned at some point in the article that one of these two men, Kincaid or Jordan, had spent much of their time searching for the mineral, by which meant they were a prospector. They were a gold hunter. So that led to another idea is that these were frustrated gold hunters who wanted to create some kind of stir that would then get people to go down back into the canyons and ostensibly looking for this hidden city, the real purpose of which was to prospect for gold. That's possible as well. The other idea, the third one, is that the Smithsonian is lying.
Right.
And that there has been a gigantic cover-up of this miraculous discovery in 1909, and that all of these things exist. And there are people who still claim this quite vehemently. I've encountered at least one of them. Their argument, there are whole parts of the Grand Canyon you can't go into. They're off limits. And why is that? Because the military is in there guarding these ruins. Why? Well, because if we knew about all of this, it would change our whole history of the world and society would collapse because we'd all go berserk. It's the same sort of explanation given as to why they can't tell us there were aliens, because even though most people seem to think there probably are aliens, haven't you seen enough movies with aliens in them? People, I think, would be pretty much prepared for that. I don't think it would be a complete completely flabbergasting if that turned out to be true. But I digress. Okay. Leave the aliens out of this for the time being as much as possible. Although inevitably,
they'll come back.
They're always lurking around in the dark, aren't they? They're always there.
Atlantis.
What can we not blame on the aliens if we really wanted to? So, the idea is that, yes, there are these hidden ruins in the Grand Canyons. I've heard this idea proposed very recently and quite seriously by people, but this is pretty much what it all seems to go back to. There doesn't seem to be any reference to this prior to this 1909 article that quotes two people who don't seem to exist. So either it is a hoax or it is a vast conspiracy involving the Smithsonian Institution. Take your pick as to which those could be. But that's only that, I think, in some ways I think there's a connection between that story. Remember, what they claim to have found were caves in which there were apparently Egyptian or Egyptian-like artifacts, including mummies.
Huh.
So, how does that play out later on? Well, there are a couple of stories here. In August 1947, an article appeared in the New York Times, and it was talking about a talk that was given by a fellow by the name of Howard Hill. Howard Hill was a Hollywood press agent. His job was to be a flack for different things. And Howard Hill gave a talk to the LA Transportation Club at the LA County Museum. Yeah, so this was a fairly illustrious group of people. And what Hill was basically selling on that particular day was a story that had been generated or told to him by a fellow by the name of Dr. F. Bruce Russell. So F. Bruce Russell claimed that in 1931, while searching for gold around the Nevada, California, Arizona border area. Okay, so find Laughlin, Nevada on a map and then go out. So they're never quite clear. This is one of the things I found in the different descriptions of this story is that Russell's location of his discoveries always seem to oddly shift around in this area. But nevertheless, what it was that Russell had claimed to have found as far back as 1931 was a cavern, a whole system of caverns under the desert. And when you explored these caverns, what did you find? Well, you found all kinds of fantastic metal relics, and you found 9-foot mummies.
Uh-huh.
Okay, not ordinary Egyptian mummies, 9-foot tall mummies of a giant race from the past. And of course, gold up the wazoo all through these things. And it just went on. And there was this whole system of what would probably be one time inhabited caverns beneath this. And he had formed a company called Amazing Explorations Incorporated and courted investors to go out and uncover these caverns and all of their riches and their 9-foot mummies and bring them back for the edification of the masses. And that's essentially what this talk was about. So he hired Howard Hill to try to attract investors into this. Well, long and short of it is that nobody was ever able to discover the position of the caverns again. Funny how those things work out. It's like I've discovered this fabulous mine with more gold than you could possibly imagine, but I can't find the entrance anymore. So that never really panned out. And the story eventually faded away. But it was a fairly big deal in the press for a while and attracted some attention. So it raises a kind of interesting question. Who was this Dr. F. Bruce Russell? Well, you go through things like census and voter registration records and the rest of it, and you can find some interesting things. And one of the first places, you do get a reference in 1947. He is described as a retired psychoanalyst.
Huh.
Originally from, I think, Illinois. And so he'd come from the Midwest out to the West Coast. He was retired. He also had a partner in this, and his partner was a guy by the name of Dr. David Beauvais. He was a dentist to the stars. Very successful LA dentist, invested in a lot of real estate in places like Benedict Canyon and Pacific Palisades. So he, I think, was one of the investors which was brought into this. But if you go back a little bit further, you find out that in 1936, you find Dr. F. Bruce Russell already in LA, and he is the head of something called the Temple of Divine Science. What is he a doctor of? Apparently of divinity. from somewhere. That's never entirely clear, although he later will claim to be a medical doctor, although it was later established he had no actual medical degrees. So in 1936, he's the head of the Temple of the Divine Service, and he specialized in metaphysical healing. In 1937, he's elsewhere described as a physiognomist.
A what?
Physiognomy. I think he felt bumps on people's heads.
Oh.
Right. And he specialized in solving personal problems. So if you had a problem, you came to him and he would feel your head, or he would engage in metaphysical healing. One is beginning to get through the haze. The image of a quack is beginning to emerge here. I mean, maybe there's more to it than that, but this is kind of what I know. This is what the American Medical Association would say about this guy, the fools that they are. So he seems to have met Beauvais sometime around 1940, and they forged a kind of friendship. So what this would mean is that, remember, Bruce Russell said that he had discovered the caverns first in 1931. And that seems to have been about the time he showed up in Southern California. But we find that 5 years later, he's now practicing metaphysical healing with the Temple of Divine Science. 1939, he shows up in a city directory as a consulting psychologist. Apparently, we've gotten some movie people there. And then in 1946, just a year before the cavern story breaks, he is described as Dean of the Psychonic Science Fellowship. And he was a guest speaker at the Temple of Spiritual Truth and Light, which was a semi-theosophical New Age church in Los Angeles at the time. So if you put all those pieces together, you could say that F. Bruce Russell has a long and established history in alternative medicine and in mysticism and occultism. And therefore, I would suspect that he was probably well exposed to the Theosophist concepts of Atlantis and Lemuria. And this is one of the terms that will come up in his descriptions of these, this civilization that he has found in these caverns is, he believes, a remnant of either the Atlantean or Lemurian. And he seems to use those terms almost interchangeably, which we've noticed people often did before. But that's certainly what again, it's a kind of flash in the pan, but it shows that, in the immediately aftermath of World War II, there was this idea that there had been this fantastic discovery, which also sounds similar to the 1909 discovery in the Grand Canyon. In fact, the closest that Russell ever comes to giving a clear identification of the place where these caverns are supposedly are is he describes them as 30 miles south of St. George, Utah, near the Wolf Hole area. And if you look south of that, in the very sort of northwest corner of Arizona, there are the Wolf Hole Mountains. And that seems to be roughly what it is that he's talking about in those areas. Now, the interesting thing is that Los Angeles, by 1947, had a number of stories passed through the local press about fantastic underground civilizations. Go back 10 years to 1934, and you get the whole interesting saga of the lizard people.
Is this where the city says they dug a hole or something? And
they actually carry out some excavations for this. And here again, you've got a guy who is a write a piece of paper here. It's a guy by the name of G. Warren Shufelt. And G. Warren Shufelt, guess what? Had spent much of his career as a prospector looking for gold. That's what he was interested in. And in the process of this, he had apparently perfected different gadgets. Sometimes those are called a doodlebug, which could detect gold. Now there's also usually these machines did not do what they were This is the type of thing. Look, I'm going to sell you this device, and every time it passes near gold, this light's going to go off. See, it's going off now. Oh, here's some gold. Yeah, fakery abounds. But nevertheless, G. Warren Shufelt in 1933 claimed that using his miraculous radio X-ray machine, which could sniff out gold like a bloodhound, right, that he discovered that underneath downtown LA, radiating all over the place, from Hollywood to downtown to Pasadena, all of these was this system of hundreds of miles of caverns that had once been inhabited by the lizard people.
How do you know that?
Well, because his X-ray machine could see.
The lizards. Okay. All right.
And he probably has some ancient clay tablets given to him by priests written in anyway. So now a number of things get combined in this. The lizard people, as it turns out, were not actual David Icke lizard people.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking shape-shifting reptilians, like the British royal family, no, this is wrong. They were called this because they had a sort of sacred, their totem animal was a lizard. They were basically just a special sort of Native American. They were related to, guess who they were related to? The Maya. Here they come again. So they were a kind of, there had been 5,000 years ago, there had been a huge meteor shower. And this meteor shower had destroyed many people living on the surface, and they caused others to go underground. So their cousins, who became the actual historical Maya, apparently hid out in the jungle. But the lizard people went north and dug tunnels underneath what would become Los Angeles, and they had lived there for a long period of time, initially to protect themselves from the meteor shower. And they had then excavated. There were he had counted them out. There were 285 tunnels, often with gigantic caverns or chambers between them, and many of them were filled with gold. He thought that there were tons of gold. So he had to get some reason to people to come up with money to dig down and find this, because if it was just going to be, mummies and some spear points, no one was going to be that interested. Gold would get them there. And this had big stories in the LA Times. There's a whole map. You actually can go online and look for map, Lizard People Los Angeles map, and you'll see the map of all the tunnels that his X-ray machine had mapped out. There were a couple of preliminary excavations. They didn't come across much. As it turns out, there were lots of tunnels under LA, and those had been everything for carrying water, also bootlegging. People dig underground is one of the things they do. They did not manage to come across any lizard people tunnels with large amounts of gold, and of course the interest faded and it disappeared. But that too had been kind of a big deal at this point. I guess there is a point here. It's the idea that these stories come up fairly often, and they often tend to incorporate. The Mayans show up in this one as they do in so many of the others. So, but this isn't the only play. I mean, the idea of a hollow earth is one of those concepts that's been around for some time. And it goes back to, of underground civilization. You basically got two versions of it here. One is that the earth is permeated by systems of caverns. It's kind of like Swiss cheese. It's got all kinds of caverns in it. The other is the outright idea of the hollow earth, which is that the earth is a hollow sphere, and then the inside is just kind of an inverse of the outside. Where there are oceans, there's land, and where there's lands, there's oceans, because that just kind of figures. And one of the things, a couple of terms or names that often get connected to this are Agartha and Shambhala. Mm-hmm. Or also known as Shangri-La. So if you've seen Lost Horizons, the musical or non-musical version. Shangri-La, of course, is the mystical realm somewhere in the Himalayas where people never age, and it's like a theosophist wet dream. This is the whole, this is a ascended masters, ageless wisdom. But in fact, Shambhala kind of floats around in different places. Well, that's one of the things about it. Is Shambhala a real physical place, or does it exist in a parallel etheric realm? And what's the difference between Shambhala and Agartha? Well, some argue that Agartha or Agarthi or Agartha, pronounce it that you will, is the land, that's sort of the country, and Shambhala or Shangri-La is its capital. But these things are never clear, and they shift back and forth. They're both names that occur to describe what are most often, although not always, described as subterranean realms. Now, one of the guys who gets credit for starting much of this is a British writer by the name of Edwin Bulwer-Lytton, best known for It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. So he's known for writing a number of things, but one of them, in 1871, he wrote a book originally titled The Coming Race, which was then later retitled Vril, The Power of the Coming Race. So this was a popular story. A guy eventually, falls down a hole, finds himself in this subterranean world inhabited by people who have all kinds of remarkable technology. The people are called the Vrilya, the Vril people. And Vril is the energy that they use to do everything, to weapons, to create food, to power their machinery. And one of the things this guy realizes is that these people really have a tremendously superior technology. And if they all came out of their holes, they could conquer all of us on the surface very quickly, which is the sort of implicit threat in this. But like all subterranean peoples, they tend to be secretive and standoffish and contemptuous of people who live on the surface. And I've seen it mentioned that Bulwer-Lytton is the guy who invents the concept of Agartha. But that name doesn't appear in the story. The Vrilya live in a land they call Ana, A-N-A. Begins with an A. That's the only kind of similarity between it. But the idea is sort of there, that you've got this concept of a super civilization that exists beneath the surface of the earth. Now keep in mind, Bulwer-Lytton wrote this as a novel. Okay, it was never meant to be taken seriously, even though people would later take it seriously. Bulwer-Lytton has been described as a Rosicrucian, which seems to have been news to him. What it was that a thing called the Societas Rosicruciana in England, the British Rosicrucian Society, anointed him an honorary member of their society, apparently without his or he was just pretending he wasn't. Maybe he was a Rosicrucian, maybe he wasn't, but it basically seemed to be a big surprise to him. And so it's really unclear and quite unlikely that Bulwer-Lytton had any sort of grand occultish scheme in his writings. But these ideas fit with other things and were kind of appropriated for those purposes. The outright hollow earth, that's one of those things that seems to have cropped up again in the 1600s. There was Edmund Halley, Halley's Comet, Halley's Comet guy. He thought that the earth was probably hollow. It was a hollow sphere, just because that seemed to be a logical thing. It was a kind of fringe belief. You would find people advocating this through the 17th and 18th century occasionally. It was never caught on in the mainstream. And gradually somehow blended with this concept of Shambhala and Agartha as underground realms. But then when you start looking around, all kinds of people have said, for instance, among Native American peoples, the Hopi are often citing, the Hopi, they were the ant people who came from underground. We crawled out of a hole to the surface. There was some kind of catastrophe. Everybody went into holes and then they came out. But it turns out that, the Choctaw, some of the Iroquois, and you couldn't go across and find some trip over some tribe that didn't have a very similar idea. And those ideas are also common in certain European and Asian cultures and probably African cultures as well. Probably for a fairly simple reason, is that if you were looking for a refuge from, let's say, really, really bad weather, caves or caverns are the place to go, at least temporarily. So it certainly seems likely that human beings, en masse in some cases, may have sought refuge underground. So another guy, Athanasius Kircher, who is a Jesuit occult-inclined scholar in the 17th century, also wrote a book called Mundus Subterraneus, in which he talked about the existence or possible existence of subterranean realms, including a hollow earth. And so the idea has been around for some time, never taken too seriously. It then becomes more of a thing when you get to, again, the late 19th century. I mean, that same period where we saw the whole sort of Lemuria and Atlantis myths taking shape. So there's a Frenchman by the name of Louis Jacquelot, who in 1873 wrote a book, again, largely a novel, called The Sons of God, in which he proposed that Agartha or Shambhala was the center of a kind of realm of super beings who lived under the ground. And then you come along in the 1880s and 1890s, and you get the French occultist Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedre. I've mentioned in another episode, was the fellow who was approached by representatives of the Ascended Masters, particularly a guy by the name of Haji Sharif, and they were revealing to him the existence of the Ascended Masters and the King of the World and the underground realm of Agartha, which he was supposed to keep secret, but instead blabbed about, and they became upset and he disavowed his work. But that sort of established that in the occultosphere, the concept. And that's really where you get into these different early versions. The early version of Agartha, remember, sometimes it's spelled different. Usually it's Agharta, Agartha, but it can be Agarti, or it can be Agartha, or early on it was Asgartha or Asgarth, which, your Nordic mythology, that sounds an awful lot like Asgard, because that's basically what they were saying it was. Yeah. So, see, now you get this connection between supposedly the realm of the Ascended Masters somewhere in the Himalayas or Central Asia, which also bears the same name as the, realm of the Nordic gods, and, which then brings us back to things like Hyperborea. Should give it a little mention to Hyperborea. Hyperborea is also one of these mystical lands in the far north. And that's something that the sort of Nazi Theosophists turned into the realm of Thule and other sort of Aryan home, Atlantis in the far north. Hyperborea to the Greeks was the land of eternal sunshine. It was, if you went far enough north, eventually you went into a land where it was warm and sunny all the time. And I don't think it takes a lot to explain what was happening there. If you go north in the summer, which is about the only time you should go into the far north, and you can, well, what are you going to run across? Well, it's going to be summer. It's going to be pretty green. And guess what? The sun never sets. So you got to imagine some guy coming from Greece or Egypt or someplace, I don't know, going to Lapland, Iceland, except theoretically there was nobody there at the time, going up into the far north, and It just stays light all the time. It just must be a paradise all the time because you're not there in the winter. So that is where certainly the whole idea of Hyperborea comes from. But Saint-Yves d'Alvedra sort of planted this whole idea of a mystical underground realm that was then elaborated by other people. So in 1922, you get a Polish adventurer by the name of Ferdynand Ossendowski. Very doubtful character. He'd probably been a spy, a political activist. He ends up in Mongolia in the early 1920s as one of the right-hand men of a fellow by the name of the Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, who probably deserves his own episode. And the Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, how do I make this very simple? He was a white Russian officer, that is an anti-Soviet Russian officer engaged in the Russian Civil War in Siberia. Yes, his name was von Ungern-Sternberg. That's because his family was of German origin. He's also a psychopath. I think that's a fair way to describe him. He's a homicidal maniac who controls an army. Not a very big army, but if you're a homicidal maniac, any kind of army will do. And for a while, he sort of captures most of Mongolia and makes himself the warlord of it, kills a lot of people, does a variety of crazy things. Ossendowski finds himself as a refugee in Mongolia, doesn't get killed by the Baron, but is instead befriended by him. And the Baron supposedly tells him all of these stories about going out and there's this cavern out in the Gobi Desert somewhere. And that's the realm, that's for the king of the world. This term, the roi du monde, the king of the world, becomes associated with Shambhala or Agartha. So if you go down into this hole, you'll come to a subterranean realm, and it's ruled by the king of the world, who is this very powerful figure who at some point might emerge to conquer the surface. Doesn't take a lot of imagination to equate the king of the world with who?
Satan? No.
Satan.
Okay.
King of the, lives underground.
Lord of this world, yeah.
King of the Lord of this world. Okay. So, if you wanted to put a Christian interpretation on it, this is a clear reference to hell and the devil and all the evil connected with him. It's all of these things at once.
Yeah.
Okay. It's all of these stories that come around. But there's a whole, and you can find more of these things. The ideas become more and more elaborated as time goes on of the idea. In some cases, Shambhala becomes the capital of the hollow earth. Okay. Remember, the hollow earth in some cases is supposed to have, there are holes supposedly at the North and South Pole, maybe iced over, but there are holes and you can fly into them and you can fly into the hollow earth, even though I don't, nobody can prove that they've ever done that. Edgar Rice Burroughs, the creator of Tarzan and of John Carter of Mars, when I was a teenager and reading all of the Edgar Rice Burroughs books, among my favorite were the Pellucidar series. And Pellucidar is all about his version of the hollow earth, which you have to get to by building a drill and drilling down inside. Burroughs' hollow earth is inhabited by what? Dinosaurs and cavemen. Yeah. And, in some cases, like super dinosaurs. Okay. They control people if not. Anyway.
Huh.
And Tarzan goes to the hollow earth. And
Really?
there's a Zeppelin.
Wow.
So it's great. You get like a German Zeppelin, Tarzan, and super dinosaurs all, without even Hitler at this point. So it's just, you see, this is how you get one step beyond that. And now you have the Nazis going through a hole in Antarctica into the hollow earth, and then Hitler living on riding his pet dinosaur. All right. It just all is a continual elaboration of the stories as we go on. So it's a story that never really ends in a lot of respects, but we haven't gotten to the end of it yet, because there are other groups, and I'm going to save for the last of this I think sometimes people ask me, what's your favorite secret society? And I'm usually kind of stumped by that because it's being like asked, what's my favorite color? What was my favorite food? But I have decided there is one, and it's the ancient and noble order of the Blue Lemu.
Okay.
Okay. So how does that figure into this? Well, just hang on. We'll get there. There's a big question there. What's a Lemu?
And why are they blue?
And why is it blue? That's part of the mystery. Don't even know what a Lemu is. And so you don't know why a blue Lemu would be different than, say, a pink Lemu. But nevertheless, those are the parts of it. So, what we have is, well, there are a couple of other guys we look at here, and this actually, this connects things together like Mount Shasta. And yes, we'll even get aliens involved in this. They're going to show up. So just to give some examples of this, there were a couple of Theosophy spin-offs. So one of the things that Blavatsky's Theosophy would do would then create these spin-off religious mystical movements. And one of them was a thing called the Brotherhood of the White Temple. So the Brotherhood of the White Temple began around 1930 in Los Angeles, and that eventually moved its headquarters to Denver, and then later would move its headquarters to the little town of Sedalia, Colorado. And the head of it was a fellow who called himself Maurice Doreal. Now, his real name was Claude Doggins, and he was from Oklahoma. And he apparently first became a kind of preacher, and then got more into mysticism, and then formed his Brotherhood of the White Temple, which was pretty clearly a straightforward ripoff of Theosophy, Ascended Masters and all the rest. And he claimed, Blavatsky had claimed to have studied in Tibet at the feet of the lamas. And so he claimed the same thing. He spent 5 years studying in Tibet. He also claimed to have been to Egypt and to have gone to the Great Pyramids, and guided by his spiritual guides to have discovered the emerald tablets of Thoth, which contain all kinds of cool mystical doctrine.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, for any of you who are acquainted with the idea of Hermes Trismegistus and of Hermetic magic and mysticism and the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, who, by the way, Hermes is just the Greek name for Thoth, you might figure, oh, that's what Doreal is talking about. No. He made it very clear that wasn't what this is a different Thoth, and these are different emerald tablets. Even though that's pretty clearly where he got the story from.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm talking about another Thoth. But he claimed to have, the real mystical truth, whatever that might be. And that's what he formed his brother. He had visited Egypt supposedly in 1925, although pretty much records show that he was nowhere near Egypt in 1925. And the other thing is that the Thoth that he was talking about wasn't Hermes Trismegistus. It was Thoth the Atlantean. Okay. So this goes back even further than that. This is from Atlantis. And of course, Doreal is well-schooled in Theosophy. He even claims to have met around 1931 when he first formed this, two Atlanteans in L.A. just walking down a street, Hollywood and Vine. And these two Atlanteans came up and said, hey, we know you got this mystical doctrine. We're going to help you form the Brotherhood of the White Temple. How did he know they were Atlanteans? Who knows? But probably because we're Atlanteans and we're here to help you. So remember, this gets everything from, so where does the hollow earth come into this? Well, the other thing he believed, apparently tipped off by the Atlanteans, is that yes, the earth is full of tunnels. And in those tunnels are good people and bad people, including the serpent people. Okay. Now these, if you're waiting for it, are real David Icke snake people. And these are the reptilians of modern legend. This is one of the places they show up. They are evil. They are in league with the Antichrist, and they intend to conquer the world and enslave and destroy all good humans. And that, of course, is what the Brotherhood of the White Temple is there to prevent. Now, by the 1950s, Doriel would add a couple of other things into the story. One was imminent nuclear holocaust, which is why he moved out to Sedalia, Colorado, because he believed the valley he was in, his followers would survive the nuclear holocaust, just like Charles Manson and his followers. And then the other thing is that the aliens, there were good aliens and there were bad aliens. And now the Antichrist and the evil aliens and the snake people were all combining together against God, Jesus, the ascended masters, and Doriel and his followers. He died, I think, around 1963. His movement rather quickly faded away. I think later on there were some accusations of possible sexual abuse that was going on in his cult, but that's another story entirely. But it's got everything in one place. Lizard people, aliens, subterranean cities, Atlanteans. They're all there. Now, something similar to that was a cult that began around the same, a religion began around the same time called the I Am Movement or I Am Activity. Founded by a couple by the name of Guy and Edna Ballard. And the story is that Guy Ballard at least was out walking around Mount Shasta one day, and he ran into the Comte de Saint-Germain, a guy who supposedly was immortal and had been around since the 16th century, but who also was one of the ascended masters of Theosophy. And Saint-Germain said, yeah, I'm just out walking around talking to my Lemurian friends, because remember, this is Mount Shasta, and so Mount Shasta becomes this kind of holy mountain in the I Am movement. That becomes a fairly big deal. By 1938, there were 1 million subscribers, at least nominal members of the group. Ballard himself would die in 1939, although he told his followers he wouldn't die, so that was a big setback. And then subsequently his wife and son, who continued to run the organization, were successfully prosecuted for mail fraud in 1942, either because they were engaged in mail fraud or it was all part of a vast government conspiracy. Take your pick. So, and remnants of that movement are still around. So if anybody's ever heard of a thing of someone called Elizabeth Clare Prophet in the Church Universal and Triumphant, they used to have a big compound up near Yellowstone. They may still do. That is a kind of modern spin-off of the I Am movement. Notice that Mount Shasta figures as a kind of holy place in that as well. And then, of course, there's the Shaver mystery. Okay, I don't want to go into a lot of time going into that, but Richard Shaver was a very interesting character. He was an artist. In the 1930s, he suffered a couple of severe setbacks when he had a kind of mental breakdown, and was institutionalized for a couple of years. Not long after that, I think this was important. His wife was killed when an electric heater she had next to the bathtub fell in and electrocuted her. So she was killed by machinery, which just from,
Sure.
might have had some impact on that. So over the next few years, Shaver was in and out of different institutions. He was hospitalized in Michigan. He basically escaped. He went to Canada. He was caught. He was deported. He was then sent to Grafton Mental Hospital in Massachusetts, and then to Ionia State Hospital back in Michigan. That's kind of interesting to me because he was in a couple of hospitals for later. This is the 30s and early 40s. In the 50s, those same hospitals were hotbeds of research for MK Ultra. Okay, this is where the CIA was carrying out experiments on mental patients. So I always just wonder, when did that begin exactly? Curious that it would be those same places. So Shaver's whole thing to try to bring his story, Shaver's tales centered around his belief that the earth was permeated by caverns, which were the home of an ancient race which had taken refuge against past catastrophes. Some of them had then gotten spaceships and gone elsewhere, but most of those who remained had degenerated down. They were not, and he called them Deros, or Dero, D-E-R-O, which supposedly stands for, what is it, deranged robot or defective robot, but they're not robots. They're simply degenerated human or humanoid creatures. There are also Teros, who were the remnants of this race, but they were good. But they appeared to be much less numerous. So the underground world was dominated by the Deros, who were maniacal, were absolutely obsessed with hatred for surface people, and which used the remnants of their superior technology, various ray machines, to torment people. So one of the things that they could do, this came up earlier. I think we were talking about occult technology in terms of influencing machines. You know, the old stories that go back all the way to the heirloom, that there are these insidious people who use these machines to beam ideas, voices in people's heads. Well, that's what Shaver claimed. He got his first introduction to this when he was working on an arc welder. And he would notice that when the arc welder was operating, for some reason, he could hear voices. And then eventually he realized that he could hear the voices of the Deros talking underground, planning all their horrible things they're going to do to him and going to do to other people. He later sort of reconstructed his life, that those years that he spent in a mental institution, he claimed he actually spent in the caverns, you know, being chased around by Deros and helped by Teros. And so it's then around 1945, the end of World War II. Pulp magazines are a big source of information for, you know, the main font for what we now call science fiction. And there was a magazine in particular called Amazing Stories, edited by a guy named Ray Palmer, who was always looking for a good story. And Shaver began to send these stories describing his past life experiences in the caverns. And he had an interesting name for this world, this civilization that existed. It was Lemuria. No, not the continent of Lemuria. There was just the past. This whole past realm was Lemuria. So his first story is called I Remember Lemuria. But he's not really talking about a continent in the Pacific. He's talking about these underground realms. So you notice that the way that the term can apply to different things. Yeah. And those stories became very popular because he was talking about, you know, I hear weird voices in my head and they're telling me to do things and it's all from the evil gnomes underground. That's basically what he was saying. And other people then wrote and go, hey, it's the same things happen to me. I know the names. I've been in the tunnels. Other people, and people would vouch, I fought Deros in the tunnels. Fred Chrisman was one of those people. So that created a real controversy in modern science fiction between people who thought that this was just a complete this was just bunk written by a crazy guy and the stories were stupid. Okay, Harlan Ellison was one of those people. I think Philip K. Dick might have been one. Yeah, they really couldn't stand this stuff, and they thought it was bringing discredit to science fiction, which should be about science. And eventually they kind of won the battle, but the Shaver mystery became this big deal. But one of the whole things was very much in promoting the idea of insidious subterranean super civilizations that were going on. So, you know, I said I was going to only bring this back to the Blue Lemu and how this figured into it. Now, the ancient and noble order of the Blue Lemu, sometimes called the ancient and venerable order of the Blue Lemu, seems to go back to the early 1930s. And it is probably the creation of a fellow by the name of Howard Bronstrup Cherub Spiridovich. Okay, Count Howard Bronstrup Cherep Spiridovich, not to be confused with the original Arthur, or Count Arthur Cherep Spiridovich, who was an actual sort of white Russian refugee, came to the U.S. in the 1920s, was a raving anti-Semite and proto-Nazi, and quasi-Theosophical mystic, who died under mysterious circumstances about 1926 on Staten Island. And then this Howard Brunstrup claimed to have been adopted by him and to have inherited his title. That too is dubious. So the main thing about the Blue Lemu is that Brunstrup and almost everyone else connected to it is essentially, well, not essentially, they're all of the extreme right quasi-Nazi or outright Nazi. This becomes it becomes a kind of American version of an Aryosophist society. They're very much into Aryan racial superiority and heraldry, and they like tracing their ancestry back to places like Atlantis, because that's cool. And so it becomes this society, which a number of people, it interests me because of the people who join it. So one of the guys who joins it is a fellow by the name of Charles Pichel, or Pitchell, Pichel. What's interesting about him is that some years later, Pichel, who, by the way, has a background as a convicted dope dealer, and also a man very much interested in ancestry and heraldry, he's the kind of guy who would research your family's illustrious history and write a whole history for it for $200 and claim everybody was a member of the nobility. Right. But Pichel later on becomes the guy who forms a thing called the Shikshenny Knights of Malta. In the 1950s, he forms this kind of bogus branch of the Knights of Malta that is peculiarly interesting because it will enlist as members almost exclusively military and intelligence officers. And it's really interesting trying to figure out what these guys are doing. Yeah. I don't think they're having barbecues. But you can't tell that they're doing much. And the same thing revolves around the Blue Lemu. So the Blue Lemu, if you look in terms of the records it produced, it describes itself as a kind of Aryan heraldic society. And it's devoted to ideas and sort of advancing the Aryan race, and it's inspired by the Holy Grail, the Templars, the Kabbalah. I don't know. I haven't found a Nazi yet. It didn't find something in the Kabbalah they didn't want. Nordic runes. And of course, the Order of the Immortal White Brotherhood. That comes up again in some way. But most interestingly enough, they argue that they are the heirs to, wait for it, the ancient, immortal Atlantean initiates of the sun. So, they're part of an ancient Atlantean order, and they have a secret base in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Why there? Because as it turns out, little did we know that the Black Hills are a remnant of Atlantis. How? Yeah. Why is there a remnant of a sunken continent in South Dakota? These are mysteries that mere mortals cannot fathom. But anyway, just like I said, Atlantis could be anywhere, including the Black Hills of South Dakota. So they promoted cosmic Christianity, whatever the hell that was. They were a noble racial order. Another guy who was a member of this is a peculiar interest of mine, Boris Brazol, another sort of white Russian anti-Semitic refugee. He was the advisor in the Jewish problem to Henry Ford. Okay, great promoter of the protocols. Yeah. An active Nazi propaganda agent in the U.S. in the 30s and into the 40s. Okay. Who, by the way, was never caught or prosecuted for anything because he was smart enough to donate all his personal papers to the Library of Congress.
Oh, interesting.
With the proviso that no one could look at them so long as he was alive. Which prevented J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI from using his personal papers and correspondence against him because they're part of the Library of Congress. And if the agreement was no one can look at them, that means no one can look at them.
Interesting.
So I thought,
Yeah.
Brazel is really quite an evil guy, but like some evil guys, he's quite ingenious in his evil and donating your incriminating materials to the Library of Congress to keep the FBI off you. That's, you got to give him credit for that. So you get all of these different, Charles Lindbergh may also have been a member of the Blue Lemu because he's hanging out with these guys. So later on, you get these reports that the Blue Lemu is some kind of Nazi propaganda front that is actively involved in Nazi propaganda or even in some kind of German intelligence of the U.S. I cannot fathom from what you can find out about the organ as to how it accomplished that. Again, it largely appears to be, for lack of a better term, a bunch of right-wing Nazi-file creeps or kooks who got together, and gave fancy names to themselves. But, it just goes back to, you don't even know what a Lemu is. Okay. It's the Blue Lemu. Why is it blue? What's a Lemu? Maybe someone out there knows what a Lemu. The closest I've been able to find is that there is a word something like Lemu, I'm not sure it's pronounced that way, in Sanskrit, which means banner or something which is hung. So that could be what they're talking about. Or maybe not. Maybe that's the whole thing. Let's come up with a nonsense word. Lemu. There we go. But yes, they've got everything sort of added within this. They are great believers in all of their belief is called theochristicism. Okay, which you think has something to do with Christianity, but not. Theochristic simply means anointed by God, because the Christ is simply the anointed. So, kind of pseudo-Christian as with the Doggins and the rest. But I think that if nothing else, what we've gone over just shows how complicated a seemingly simple question can be. If you go hunting for Atlantis and Lemuria, where does it lead you? To the Blue Lemu.